At the will reading, my parents laughed while handing my sister $6.9 million. They gave me $1 and said, "Go earn your own." My mother smirked. Some kids just don't measure up. But when the lawyer read Grandpa's final letter, my mom started screaming. That was the sound that struck hardest, not the lawyer's polite, measured voice, nor the crisp snap of the bank check. My sister, Leanna, accepted with a graceful, practiced nod. It was the sound of my parents' unfiltered joy. A sound that was always reserved for Leanna's victories. Never mine. The room, paneled in dark cherry wood and smelling faintly of old paper and dust motes dancing in the cold afternoon light, suddenly felt too bright, too focused. My hands rested flat on the polished mahogany table, steady and silent, even as the single dollar slid toward me. It was crisp, newly minted, and utterly mocking. It lay between my fingertips and the sealed, heavy letter that the lawyer, Mr. Henderson, still held back. My father, Robert, didn't blink. His gray eyes, usually busy assessing quarterly returns, rested on me with a flat, judgmental clarity I knew well. "Go earn your own, Josephine." He repeated, the words a low, final verdict. They contained no disappointment, only an expectation that had been met. My mother, Clarissa, sat beside him, the picture of elegant self, satisfaction in her muted olive dress. She didn't just agree with my father, she enhanced the cruelty. "Some kids just don't measure up," she said, her smile small, almost pleased with herself. She looked around the table, waiting for consensus. No one disagreed. Not the lawyer, not Leanna, who merely smoothed the check with one long, manicured nail, adjusting her golden halo of hair. She didn't look at me, she didn't have to. We all understood the script. Josephine was the placeholder, the steady disappointment, the one who didn't merit a legacy. I stayed silent. Invisibility, I learned early, wasn't the absence of sight, it was the active, conscious act of being pretended away. I'd spent 32 years mastering the art of being unobserved. It was the only way to survive the Hartman dining table, where plates were passed over my hands, and conversations flowed around me as if I were merely a piece of furniture. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, his gaze flickering nervously toward the sealed envelope marked, "In my grandfather Walter's familiar." Looping script. For Josephine. Alone. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics but unwilling to intervene. Walter, my grandfather, had been the only person in this family to ever acknowledge my presence. His death had ripped away the one anchor I had. Leanna, having secured her fortune, spoke in a hushed, condolence-tinged voice to my mother. "It's just such a shock, what Grandpa did. Giving away the lake house like that. Will challenge the property deed, of course." My father interjected. "The rest of the estate is sound, and we maintain control of the foundation. Josephine's portion is, well, appropriate." He glanced at the dollar. The contempt was thick enough to taste. I looked at the sealed envelope on the lawyer's desk. Walter had known this would happen. He knew the theatrical cruelty, the public shame. The dollar meant to mock my entire life's work. It felt like a small, heavy brick of potential truth, waiting patiently. Suddenly, Walter's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, pushed the sealed envelope across the table toward me. He didn't offer an apology or an explanation, just a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Hartman stipulated that this must be delivered to you before the reading could be formally closed, Josephine," he stated. It is the final part of his instructions. My mother's smug smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes narrowed. What letter? Why is there a separate letter? Everything relevant was in the main will," she demanded, her voice losing its carefully practiced softness. I reached out and took the envelope. It felt cool, thick, and significant. For the first time since walking into the room, my focus wasn't on their laughter, but on the silent promise contained within the paper. Walter hadn't forgotten me. He had simply planned for this precise moment of public dismissal. The will reading wasn't the end, it was the setup. My father started to speak, a low, legal threat forming on his lips about executor overreach. But I cut him off, not with words, but with action. I stood up, the chair scraping quietly against the wooden floor, and tucked the sealed envelope into my jacket pocket, the dollar remaining on the table. "The reading is closed, then," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I walked out. No door slam, no dramatic exit, just the soft, decisive click of the latch behind me. The cold air outside was a relief, sharp enough to cut through the suffocating heat of their entitlement. As I walked to my car, I could still hear their confused, angry voices rising from inside the house. The lake house, the true centerpiece of their current greed, was already looming in my future, now marked by a key and a cryptic command I had yet to decipher. I drove away, placing the sealed envelope on the passenger seat, the weight of Walter's trust, replacing the dead weight of my parents' neglect. The trees on the roadside blurred into a single, muted line, freeing me with every mile from the sound of their laughter. The lake house would be the end of their story, and the beginning of mine. The mocking dollar felt heavier than Leanna's check. It forced me back into the cold geometry of my childhood, where my grandfather, Walter, was the only line of warmth. I didn't need to drive away to find the silence. I carried it with me. Growing up in the Hartman house, I learned early that silence wasn't just a physical absence of sound, it was a companion, a constant presence that sat beside you even when the whole family was at the table. At 8, I learned how invisibility worked. It wasn't that no one saw you, it was that they pretended not to. I remembered one afternoon in late fall, the air filled with the same kind of cold, flat light that had spilled across the will reading table today. My mother was arranging trophies on the living room shelf. Every brass plate, every polished award belonged to Liana Debate. Medals, piano competition awards, glass plaques etched with her name in sharp, confident letters. My own achievement. A blue ribbon I had earned at the county science fair for a detailed study on wetland ecosystems, sat folded on the corner of a side table. No frame, no polish, just a limp strip of blue satin. By the end of that evening, it wasn't there anymore. When I asked about it the next morning, my father merely waved a dismissive hand. "Focus on real achievements, Josephine," he'd said, tapping Leanna's shoulder while detailing which prestigious internships she'd apply for next. He spoke to me differently. Not like a daughter, but like a placeholder, the one expected to manage the administrative duties no one else wanted, walking the dog, sorting the recycling, returning forgotten items to the dry cleaner. "You're steady, Josephine," he'd stated once, leaning against a door frame, observing me as if I were a piece of reliable machinery. It was not a compliment, it was a consolation prize. Steadiness, to them, meant predictability and lack of ambition. It meant I was safely out of the way. The only person who didn't talk to me that way was my grandfather, Walter. His voice was slow, patient, as if he were genuinely letting me decide whether his questions deserved answers. He was the exception to the geometry of neglect. He would take me to the lake house on weekends, away from the city's frantic energy. The scent of old cedar wood and the quiet, rhythmic thrum of water against the dock would settle into my bones, easing the constant emotional tension I carried. He kept 2 fishing rods there. One was brand new, gleaming and impersonal. The other was an older rod, carved with his initials, worn smooth by years of use. He always handed me the carved one. "People pay attention to the wrong things, Joey," he told me, sitting on the edge of the dock, his line cast into the still, dark water. "They look at the surface, at the ripple. They don't look at the pull underneath." Those afternoons were the only time I felt completely seen. We would sit for hours, our lines in the water, letting the wind shift the reflections on the surface. He never once asked why I was so quiet. He already understood that silence was my chosen country. Once, he nudged his chin toward a blue heron perched on the railing, its feathers ruffled by the breeze. "Watch long enough," he said, "and you notice what others miss. The shift of a feather, the moment before flight. The truth is always in the smallest details." I didn't realize it then, but he was giving me the very skill my family lacked. The ability to read between the actions, to track the truth hidden beneath appearances. It was the foundation of my career as a corporate investigator, and ironically, it was the skill that made me dangerous to them. One winter break, years later, when Liana won another major award, my parents threw a lavish dinner party. The house was filled with bright voices and heavy perfumes. I stood near the hallway, collecting coats. As I passed the dining table, I heard my mother laugh softly, the same sound she made today at the reading. "Osifin is fine," she told a guest, minimizing me with casual ease. "She doesn't need much." That sentence stayed with me longer than any direct argument could have. It was the exact moment I understood the core rule of the Hartman family: needing nothing meant deserving nothing. They didn't act out of active malice. They simply and profoundly believed their own story about who deserved their attention, their resources, and their love. I drove straight to the lake house the next morning. It was a pilgrimage. Walter was already at the dock, sorting through his tackle boxes, the air cold, the water still. When he saw me, he didn't ask why I'd come early. He just handed me the carved rod and waited until I sat beside him. That was the day I learned my place in the Hartman family, and that was the day I realized I would eventually have to choose whether to stay in it or leave it entirely. And now, hours after the will reading, after the humiliation of the dollar and the threat of my father's gaze, I sat in my car, staring at the sealed envelope on the passenger seat. I hadn't gone home. I had driven past the town limits, deciding I could not return to that house of mirrors until I knew exactly what Walter's last act meant. The paper felt like a direct line back to that cold dock, back to his patient voice, telling me to look under the surface. I pulled into the parking lot of the small inn near the ridge, a place Walter and I had stopped at years ago for hot chocolate. It was time to open the letter and find out where my steady, quiet life was about to be bent. The letter in my hands felt like a handshake across the grave. Walter's last, patient lesson. It was time to start where the truth was first bent. I pulled into the small parking lot of the River Ridge Inn, a place smelling faintly of wood smoke and old coffee. I checked in without giving a reason. Rosa, the kind, older woman who owned the place, recognized my name but didn't ask questions. A rare mercy. She simply handed me a key and pointed toward a quiet corner room. It was a gift, four walls that demanded nothing from me. Inside, I set my notebook on the small, scarred wooden desk. This was the first safe space I'd had in years, a bubble of silence where my parents' voices couldn't penetrate. Only then did I finally break the wax seal on the envelope. It contained three things: a small, antique-looking key with a distinctive, curled handle, a short letter written in Walter's familiar, elegant hand, and a set of numbers arranged in 4 tidy columns. I read the letter first, tracing the loops of his pen. It was short, not a sentimental farewell, but a direct instruction. Walter had always treated me like a colleague, never just a grandchild. "My dear Joey," the letter began, "they will give you $1, and they will think they have won. They have only started. I have left you the foundation of everything. You know what you do best. Find the hidden pattern. And remember this: start where the truth was first bent. The key will only open one door. Use your sight, not your hearing. No further explanation. Just a challenge rooted in my core skill: Observation and investigation. I read the single line. Start where the truth was first bent. 3 more times, letting the weight of the phrase settle. Where had the honesty in my family first cracked? Not with the dollar, but with the money. I pushed the key and the letter aside and focused on the 4 columns of numbers. They looked deceptively simple, a series of dates, corresponding dollar amounts, and cryptic reference codes. I recognized them as accounting shorthand. I powered on my laptop, the screen illuminating the small, quiet room, and began the work I knew best: quiet, methodical, and precise. There was no fury in the work, no tears, just a sharp, professional clarity. My grief for Walter was channeled into this focus. I started running the numbers. First, I treated the columns as dates, cross-referencing them against known milestones in Walter's company history. Nothing aligned cleanly. Then, I treated them as entries, trying to match them to public filings I could access remotely through my old Investigator accounts. Still nothing that jumped out immediately. It was only when I treated the numbers as valuations and mapped them against the years listed that a subtle pattern began to emerge. The amounts, once seen in chronological sequence, were oddly rounded. They were always just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic, external review. It was a classic tactic, a slow, steady siphon of funds designed to look like routine operating costs. A lie told through boring repetition. The truth wasn't hiding, it was sitting in plain view, waiting for someone who wasn't invested in the illusion to actually look. I opened a fresh document and began coding the entries. When something didn't align with market rates, I highlighted it yellow. When the amounts repeated with suspicious regularity, I boxed it in red. Hours passed like minutes, the outside world receding until there was only me. The glow of the screen and the relentless logic of the data. I traced the repeated, rounded payments. A particular pattern, recurring over 5 years, kept pointing back to a small shell entity, a corporate structure often used to mask financial beneficiaries. I had researched that entity years ago. My father, Robert, had advised on its setup and legal architecture. He was a brilliant lawyer, and he specialized in making the difficult look simple, and the illegal look routine. A cold certainty settled in my chest. Not surprise, not even disappointment, just confirmation. Confirmation of what the silence had been whispering to me all my life. The neglect wasn't random. It was a distraction. I was irrelevant because I was the only person who might actually look at the books and not see the surface. I drew a clean line across my notebook page. My hypothesis was solid. Now, I needed the proof that only Walter could have compiled. I began assembling a professional timeline, listing dates, locations, the known signatures, and financial inconsistencies. No accusations, no speculation. Only facts arranged cleanly enough that they would speak without interpretation. I didn't need to fight them. The truth could do that on its own. As the late afternoon sun dipped behind the hills, painting the small room in bruised shades of purple and orange, I reached for the second item from the envelope, the antique key. I knew exactly which door it belonged to. It was the locked, small cabinet beneath Walter's study desk at the lake house. The one he always touched, an almost superstitious habit, before he left the room. A small, strange detail I'd filed away years ago. The cryptic instruction, "Use your sight, not your hearing," was clear. I had seen the facts. Now, I needed the physical evidence hidden by the key. I closed my laptop, slid my notebook into my bag, and knew exactly where I had to go. I had to return to the heart of the betrayal to retrieve the final weapon. The anomalies weren't hiding. They were waiting for someone who didn't want the lie to be true. And the evidence began to map itself directly onto my parents' timeline. I stayed at the inn, dedicating the next 24 hours to the investigation. The room became my bunker, the the desk cluttered with notes and printouts. I wasn't driven by frantic anger, but by a cold, surgical focus. This was more than just exposing my family. This was the ultimate test of the only skill Walter had ever truly respected in me. I began pulling archived digital documents tied to Walter's old biomedical research company, the Foundation's precursor. I cross-referenced the cryptic reference codes from Walter's list against internal accounting logs. The system was complex, designed to look impenetrably dense to anyone without a deep familiarity with financial fraud layering, which, ironically, my father, Robert, had specialized in teaching during his early legal career. I noticed a specific set of wire transfers. They were routed through 3 offshore accounts and then deposited into the shell entity I had identified, the one my father had advised on setting up. The pattern was elegant in its deception. The dollar amounts were always substantial, often exceeding $20,000, but, critically, they were rounded to the nearest $500, making them look like contractual fees or retainers. I mapped the dates of these payments against significant events in the family's history. An unusually large deposit occurred the week Liana bought her first condominium. Another, even larger one, happened just before the family celebrated the groundbreaking of their new boathouse at the lake. The family's achievements, Liana's success, their escalating lifestyle, it was all financed by the slow, steady bleed of Walter's company, carefully disguised as legal expense. It was no longer just about financial anomalies. The numbers were telling a story of entitlement. The numbers were telling a story of entitlement. A belief that Walter's hard-earned money was simply their inheritance, regardless of whether he was alive to contest it. The fact that the payments began nearly 7 years ago, while Walter was still actively managing the company, painted a picture of deep, prolonged betrayal. They weren't waiting for him to die. They were actively undermining him and his legacy while presenting a face of loving, concerned family members. My fingers tired, but my mind was relentlessly clear. When something repeated, I drew a box around it in heavy red marker. When I found my mother, Clarissa's signature on a series of advisory memos she had always dismissed as routine paperwork, I circled it twice. These memos, when read in sequence, showed a calculated effort to strip Walter of control over specific assets, advice that always benefited the family's personal holding company. My parents hadn't been Walter's confidantes, they had been his quiet, methodical adversaries. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of the realization settling over me. Not shock, not even the raw pain of the initial betrayal. Just a cold, satisfying confirmation. The reason for their neglect, their condescension, and their insistence on my mediocrity was simple. I was the one variable they couldn't control. I was the steady one, the one who looked at the details, and the one person who might eventually connect the dots between the trophy display and the hidden bank transfers. "You're steady, Josephine," my father's voice echoed in my memory. Now I knew that steadiness wasn't a consolation prize, it was a threat. I drew a clean, thick line on a new notebook page. I began assembling the professional timeline: date, location, the specific fraudulent action, the public record that contradicted it, and the known family signature involved. I included no accusations, only verifiable, publicly accessible data coupled with the clues Walter had provided. My document was a quiet weapon. I realized I didn't need to fight them verbally. They could argue against emotion, against feeling, against my place in the family. They could not argue against a timeline of facts grounded in public record and Walter's own tucked away materials. When the sun finally dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the room, I took out the antique key. It felt warm in my palm. The last piece of the puzzle lay behind the lock in Walter's study. I closed my notebook, slid it securely into my investigator's bag, and headed back toward the lake house. This time, I wasn't just walking into their house, I was walking into the crime scene. The house was full of their nervous, entitled laughter. I slipped inside, moving through the shadows not as a ghost, but as a silent administrator entering the system Walter built. I drove back to the lake house after twilight. The cars, my father's expensive German sedan and Leanna's pristine hybrid, were positioned neatly in the driveway, like pieces on a perfectly staged board. I moved quietly, the damp wooden planks of the deck absorbing my steps. There was no need for confrontation or fanfare. Inside, the house was dimly lit. A few lamps glowed in the hallway, casting elongated shadows. Laughter drifted from the living room, thin and uneven. They were talking about investment projections, still hungry, still focused only on the numbers they believed were theirs. The greed in their voices was palpable, a low hum beneath the conversation. I slipped into Walter's study without being seen. The room was cool, holding the faint, familiar scent of old books and cedar. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness to the hypocrisy outside. I knelt beside the desk. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light, illuminating the area around the locked cabinet beneath the writing surface. The metal slot was small, inconspicuous. I took the antique key from my pocket. It fit perfectly, smoothly into the lock. It clicked open with a soft, precise sound that felt utterly final. It was the sound of a closing argument. Inside, the cabinet was meticulously organized. There were thin binders, labeled only by years, a small stack of notes in Walter's precise handwriting, a stack of printed emails, and a single, sealed envelope addressed to me. Sealed with the same care as the first. I didn't open that second envelope yet. The order was important. I sorted through the binders. Page after page confirmed what I had already traced on my laptop. They were internal company documents, accounting notes, and correspondence that proved my parents' direct involvement in decision, making that systematically stripped Walter of control. The rounded payments, the notes written in my father's clinical legal phrasing, the pattern of advice that never matched the ethical outcomes. It was all laid bare. I worked quickly, scanning the most critical pages with my phone, storing the digital copies in an encrypted cloud folder, and backing them up twice. Simple. Professional, clean. No fingerprints, no speculation, just the collection of evidence. As I was securing the last binder, my eye caught a subtle shape in the corner of the study. It was a lens, no larger than my thumbnail, blending seamlessly into the dark wood frame of the bookshelf. A surveillance camera. I hadn't noticed it before. I stood slowly, letting the realization settle like dust in a quiet room. The lake house wasn't just a place of escape for Walter. It was the system. System. My grandfather's letter had said, "The truth is only effective when the right people see it." The lake house recorded everything. Their movements, their greedy actions, their callous words, their intent. All captured, waiting to be accessed. This wasn't mere revenge. This was a calculated, controlled administration of justice, carried out by a system Walter had built, now placed meticulously in my hands. He hadn't just given me evidence. He had given me the means of presentation. He gave me the perfect weapon for a fight against people who believed their own performance was reality. The camera was the ultimate proof that the truth wasn't theoretical, it was filmed, documented, and undeniable. I closed the cabinet, locked it again, and slipped the antique key back into my pocket. There was no need to announce anything. Not yet. The element of surprise was the last gift Walter had given me. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard my mother's voice rise from the living room. Crisp and absolutely certain. "Josephine will stay out of this. She never had the mind for complex matters. Josephine will stay out of this. She never had the mind for complex matters." I paused, unseen in the dim hall. Their voices, confident in their shared illusion, filled the house. They were completely unaware that the walls were finally listening, and that I was the one holding the recording. I turned away, steady and silent. This time, I wasn't here to be included. I was here to finish what he started. The confrontation was coming, and I knew exactly what they were about to measure up to. I walked back into the lake house in the morning light, feeling the quiet authority of the key in my pocket. This was not a negotiation. It was an administration of consequence. The air inside was tense, heavy with forced composure. My parents were already dressed. Far too formal for the early hour, their faces set in expressions of strained control. They had been moving through the house like surveyors, sorting files and discussing property leverage. Leanna hovered near them, twisting the edge of her expensive silk sleeve, showing rare signs of genuine nervousness that weren't for show. Even she sensed the air was different. When the knock sounded sharply on the oak front door, all three of them straightened, bracing themselves, as if they expected an audience demanding applause for their recent acquisition. It was only Mr. Boone. Not Mr. Henderson, the estate lawyer, but Mr. Boone, Walter's longtime friend, and the trusted legal counsel of the Research Foundation. He was carrying a slim, dark folder and a small, nondescript digital device. He nodded at me first, a flicker of acknowledgement that went unnoticed by my parents, then gave the briefest of nods to the others. He offered no greeting. My mother, Clarissa, immediately tightened her smile. Is this necessary, Boone? We were just finalizing the accounting review. He didn't answer. He simply walked to the dining table, the same table where I had been dismissed yesterday, and set the folder down. He placed the small device next to it. The silence in the room stretched taut, pulled thin by their sudden, collective anxiety. Mr. Boone pressed a button on the device. The room filled instantly with the soft click of an audio file starting. Then came Walter's voice. It was steady, unmistakable. Recorded in the very study where my parents had spent yesterday tearing through his things. If this is being heard, it means the conditions have been met, Walter's voice stated. My father, Robert, shifted his weight, caught completely off balance. My mother's rigid expression wavered slightly. They hadn't expected the deceased to participate in the proceedings. Walter continued, the voice edged with a patient wariness. I trusted the people closest to me to handle my work with integrity. Some did not. So I left instructions to ensure the truth would be seen clearly, without debate. There was a second, sharp click. Footage instantly appeared on the small screen of the device. It was shaky at first, then settled, revealing a familiar angle. The interior of Walter's study, filmed from the perspective of the hidden camera. And there were my parents, less than 20, 4 hours ago, opening drawers, lifting framed photos, and evaluating items like inventory. Their voices, captured clearly by the hidden microphone, carried plainly across the quiet room. They spoke of property value, leverage, and their entitlement to every last piece of the estate. My mother stepped forward, her controlled voice breaking into a frantic hiss. This is taken completely out of context. We were. Mr. Boone raised one hand. His motion was small but absolute. Silence, Mrs. Hartman. Please observe. Another clip followed. This time, records were projected onto the screen columns of payments, detailed notes, rounded numbers. The exact anomalies I had circled in red in my notebook. The footage showed Walter's own handwriting next to the financial ledger, flagging the transactions. My father's initials appeared more than once, linked directly to the shell entity I had investigated. My mother's signature was displayed on the advisory memos she had always claimed were routine. My father exhaled sharply, a sound of pure shock. Old paperwork misinterpreted? This doesn't prove any, he insisted. trying to regain control with his legal training. The recording shifted again, cutting him off. Walter's voice returned, softer now, but directed straight at me. Josephine, if you're hearing this, you have already seen what they hoped would never be found. The will reading was not the end. It was the beginning. He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in, the three Hartmans frozen in disbelief. Everything that comes next relies on what you choose to do with the truth that was buried. My mother's composure finally shattered. A flash of raw, exposed panic cut through her eyes. Josephine, stop this! You don't understand how these things work. But I didn't say a word. I stood perfectly still, letting the full force of my grandfather's meticulous plan play out. Their control over me had always relied on my silence. But now, my silence was the most dangerous weapon in the room. My father's denial was just noise. Then Walter's voice returned, speaking only to me, and that was the sound that shattered my mother's composure. Walter's recording continued, his tone shifting from the professional administrator to the loving, yet disappointed, grandfather. I prepared for everything, he said. I anticipated how easily the surface facts of the first reading would allow the untrustworthy to seize control. Josephine, you alone were given the necessary perspective to see the fraud for what it was. You were the only one who didn't dismiss the details. My father, Robert, made a strangled noise, half protest, half gasp. He was staring at the video evidence, seeing his careful legal structure dismantled by his own client. Then came the voice meant only for my ears, softer, now edged with a deep, private wariness. Josephine, if you're hearing this, you have already seen what they hoped would never be found. The will reading was not the end. It was the beginning. Everything that comes next relies on what you choose to do with the truth that was buried. My mother's composure finally, completely cracked. It wasn't the slow falter of yesterday. It was a violent, ugly split. Her face drained of color, and her voice rose to a terrified shriek. Josephine, stop this! You don't understand how these things work. You don't know what you're messing with? She screamed, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. It was the moment I had anticipated for 30 years. The removal of the mask, the exposure of the raw, desperate fear that fueled their entitlement. But I didn't say a word. I held her panicked gaze with the same steady, unblinking focus I used when analyzing a complex financial ledger. I was not there to argue, I was there to witness. Mr. Boone opened the folder, pulling out a set of crisp, official documents signed long before Walter's death. He spoke calmly, cutting through the chaos of my mother's hysteria. These, Mr. Boone announced, his voice carrying the authority of finality. Here are the final directives. They are non-negotiable and legally binding under separate trust agreements. He laid out the stipulations clearly. Mr. Robert Hartman and Mrs. Clarissa Hartman retain the properties assigned to them in the initial will. Your sister, Liana, retains her trust fund as stated. But the remainder of the estate, including the controlling interest in your grandfather's research foundation and all non-liquidized assets, transfers to Josephine Hartman alone. My father staggered back. Absolutely not. This can be contested. That foundation is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It can be contested, he roared, finally finding his voice, but it was a desperate, primal sound. Mr. Boone remained perfectly placid. It can, he agreed. That was Walter's primary stipulation. But if contested by any party, every single asset, the house, the trusts, the properties, everything, defaults immediately and irrevocably to the foundation in full. That was Walter's failed safe. The room went completely silent. My mother's breath hitched, a strangled noise in her throat. Liana stared at the floor, her cheeks pale, the $6.9 million check suddenly feeling like a worthless piece of paper. The cost of challenging me was total financial ruin. Mr. Boone continued, delivering the final blow. There is also a clause regarding possible legal review of past advisory work related to the F. Arden Trust entity, the entity Mr. D. Hartman advised on 5 years ago. You know which work he meant. The implication hung in the air contest the will and trigger a fraud investigation that could cost them their careers and freedom. I stepped forward, not to speak, but to perform the final silent act Walter had planned. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small, antique key from the locked cabinet, and placed it gently onto the mahogany table. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it landed with the devastating finality of a gavel. My mother flinched as if struck. She understood the symbolism instantly. I had accessed Walter's secrets, and I now possessed the power to expose everything. Mr. Boone met my eyes. All that is left is acknowledgement, Josephine. I nodded once. No anger, no cry of victory, just the clean, quiet click of something falling into its perfect, inevitable place. My parents said nothing. They didn't agree, but they understood. There was nothing left to argue. Behind them, the lake outside the window stayed still, holding its breath. The reversal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the complete, utter silence of absolute defeat. They left not in anger, but in a final, defeated silence. I stayed behind, letting the lake house settle, knowing the quiet no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. The silence that followed their exit was unlike anything I had ever experienced in the Hartman family. It wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of neglect. It was clean, clear, and vast. Robert and Clarissa left with the speed of people fleeing an unavoidable disaster, their forced composure completely dissolving into raw, impotent fury. Leanna lingered only long enough to gather her things, her gaze avoiding mine. The $6.9 million suddenly a heavy chain rather than a crown. I stayed behind, letting the lake house settle back into its natural quiet. The air inside still carried the faint, comforting smell of cedar and old paper. Walter's trace, untouched by the storm that had just passed through. I walked back into the study. I stood by his desk, my fingertips resting on the worn edge, the same place he used to tap when he was deep in thought. It felt like a boundary line, a threshold I had finally stepped over, no longer waiting for permission or inclusion. The desk was no longer a symbol of my exclusion, but a testament to his trust. Outside, the lake barely moved. A thin layer of mist hovered above the surface, rising and fading in slow, rhythmic breaths. I opened the back door and walked out onto the dock, the boards cool under my feet. This was the same dock where I had sat as a child, fishing with Walter, trying to understand the world and my place within it. Back then, he would point at the quiet surface and say, "Still water tells the truth, if you know how to listen." For the first time in months, I listened to the quiet. There were no echoes of my mother's raised voice, no sharp corrections from my father, no strained smiles from my sister. Just the soft, rhythmic lap of the lake against the wooden pilings and the steady, uncomplicated rhythm of my own breathing. I didn't replay what had happened inside. I didn't wonder whether they felt guilt or loss. Their reactions were no longer mine to carry. The documents, the recordings, the overwhelming truth. They had done their work. What remained belonged to me alone: the quiet, the foundation, and the opportunity to finally define myself outside of their judgment. The sun pushed through a break in the high clouds, laying a thin, shimmering gold stripe across the water. I watched it stretch toward me, warm and patient, like an invitation. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I sat on the edge of the dock, my feet hovering just above the surface. The cold air touched my skin lightly, almost gently, as if the lake itself recognized the shift in ownership, the shift in power. For the first time, I felt the beginning not of justice, but of freedom. Freedom from the narrative they had imposed on me for 32 years. In the end, it wasn't the documents or the recordings that truly changed anything. It was the silence that followed, the kind that settles only when the truth is no longer questioned, but finally accepted. The battle was fought not with noise, but with undeniable fact, and my reward was the cessation of conflict. Some endings arrive quietly. Some freedoms, too. I stood up from the dock, the cold of the wood leaving an impression on my skin. I turned back toward the lake house, knowing this time the quiet truly belonged to me. It was Walter's final, greatest gift, the gift of my own soundless sovereignty.